The third pillar mentioned in this hadith of Gabriel is the zakat. Quite easy to remember these two since they rhyme, often coupled in the Quran. This is a kind of religious tithe. Now, just as there is an obligatory and a spontaneous form of the salat, so also there is an obligatory and a spontaneous optional form of charity. The Quran frequently enjoins Muslims to give sadaqah, which means charity generically, including the formal form of zakat. And it recommends that they be given in secret. But it also requires more formally the giving of this zakat, which is a kind of alms tax. The word itself means purity. And a number of hadiths indicate that one's wealth, one's money and property are not considered pure unless one has shared them in a divinely appointed proportion with the needy. Only when one has discharged this responsibility can one enjoy one's possessions in good conscience. The word zakat also means growth, referring to the Prophet's insistence that no fortune ever diminished through charity. In other words, the idea is if you give, God will be pleased and will give you even more. The hadith, as incorporated into the classical canonical manuals of Islam, explains that the basic rate of zakat is 2.5%. This is a percentage not of income, but of actual wealth. In other words, at the end of each year, every Muslim has to tot up the value of whatever assets he owns, whether in cash or other forms of assets, and pay a 40th to charity. Some assets are actually exempt. For instance, if you own a house for your own use, you're not obliged to give 2.5% of its value away each year. That would be considered too onerous. But if you own an extra house, for instance, in order to make a profit selling it, then it's considered to be a zakatable asset, a word which unfortunately some Muslims in the West are now using. Quite convenient, perhaps. On certain categories, for instance, some forms of crops, and some precious metals and precious stones, the rate can go up, for instance, to 10%. The actual process of donation has typically been left to the individual, although the Quran seems to suggest that it is best supervised by the state. Today in the Muslim world, some governments collect it by the rather hit-and-miss method of adding it to income tax. But given the notorious inefficiency of some state bureaucracies in the third world, this is pretty unpopular. Some countries have made it work well. For instance, in Malaysia, if you're a Muslim, it's automatically added to your income tax every year, and the state allocates it to charitable purposes of various kinds. The problem with that is that it obliges the tax collector, sometimes by his nature not the most discerning of individuals, responsible for deciding whether a taxpayer is Muslim or Christian or something else, and that adds an extra complication. Yep.
Yeah, that was my question. Like, if you're living in Malaysia and they take it out of your income tax, I know that not. How do they do that if you're a Christian living in Malaysia, or if you're a Buddhist or something?
If you're not a Muslim, you don't pay it.
Okay, and how do they determine that? Is that in the census, or is there some?
I haven't seen the Malaysian tax form, but I assume that the government has central records and people declare themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. But as I said, in most Muslim countries, it's actually left to the individual, partly for these administrative reasons. So usually it's a private affair. Sometimes the sums involved can be fairly massive. The Sultan of Brunei, for instance, who is reputed to be the richest man in the world, even outgunning Bill Gates, is reputed to pay $600 million a year in zakat. And he does do at least some of that, because when I was doing relief work in Bosnia, I would see the Bruneians, even though it's a tiny state, actually dishing out a lot of relief effort. And they do humanitarian educational projects amongst Muslims, particularly in places like England. In England, it's been calculated that the total zakat payable by the Muslim community is about £700 million. Most of this goes as remittances to family members. It's permissible, even encouraged, to start with the poor in your own family. So this will go as remittances back to poor relations in Pakistan or Bangladesh. I'm sure the same kind of thing happens in the States. There are also Muslim charities which accept zakat. Many mosques in the West have their own zakat funds, you'll see a large chest with a slit in it in the mosque where people drop their checks or their cash. And needy individuals can apply to the mosque administration for a handout from those funds. That's really all I think I need to say about the zakat. It's fairly self-explanatory. Yes?
Sorry, could you elaborate how much, because you just kind of answered part of that question, but how do mosques obtain some funds?
Because there will be a collection box in the mosque, or people will send a check at the end of each year to the mosque committee.
And that's in addition to this?
That will be people's zakat. For instance, if my salary is $100,000 a year, I would be paying $2,500 every year, assuming that was the sum total that remained to me at the end of the year, and I could give that to the mosque to be dished out in the local community. And
Who administers the mosque? That's a question.
okay, that's another useful point. There is no canonical guidance on how a mosque is to be administered. In a lot of Muslim countries, particularly nowadays, the state keeps an eye on the mosques and appoints salaried imams. For instance, in Egypt, 10 years ago, the government nationalized all of the mosques. The reason for this being not zeal for the propagation of correct doctrine, but simply to ensure that the government wasn't being criticized by radicals from the pulpit. So they dish out approved subjects for each Friday sermon, and that's regrettably quite common in the Muslim world nowadays. And I've seen in one mosque in Cairo, near the loudspeaker, mosques tend to be big, so they use sound systems, there's always a guy who obviously doesn't fit in because he doesn't quite know what to do. Obviously from the secret police, and he has a jacket, obviously some kind of automatic weapon under his armpit. And if he hears something he really doesn't agree with, it's known that he will pull the plug on the sound system, and the imam will probably go to jail, regrettably. But it is one of the traditional responsibilities of the imam of a mosque is to draw attention to official abuse and corruption. In the West, mosques are administered generally as private charities or trusts with a management committee and subcommittees and so forth, rather as any other small charity, or perhaps even as some small autonomous Christian denominations would be run. But there is no overarching hierarchy, for instance, in the United States, no hierarchy of bishops, an archbishop and so forth. Mosques and Muslim communities generally tend to be quite jealous of their own independence. They like to do their own thing, which has advantages and has drawbacks. It means that unity on any particular issue is difficult. When the media want to know the American Muslim view on such and such a subject, who do they turn to? With Christians it's easy, you just interview the bishop. With Muslims, well, you've got 10,000 different mosques probably all saying different things. So it's a drawback in that sense, but it also has the unquestionable advantage of ensuring a certain freedom of conscience. Mosques can do their own thing, and there's no orthodoxy being imposed from above. Yeah.
Getting back to the money. In a place like Malaysia or Egypt then, where the zakat may be intermingled with tax revenues, is there any watchdog on the state to make sure they're not buying tanks and bombs and stuff like that rather than giving money to...
Generally there is, yeah. It's something they do take seriously. For instance, in Egypt, the government has its own bank called the Nasser Social Bank or something, and that's where all of the zakat funds go when they're separated out from people's income tax returns, and they do social projects, and generally it's poorly administered, as such things tend to be in the third world. And most people wish that they could just give out their zakat according to their own consciences. But again, the governments tend to have an interest in not allowing that, because people might be donating for things that the government doesn't approve of. Radical groups, publications that don't support the regime, whatever. It's a regrettable fact of life in the modern Muslim world that everything is very politicized, and the government likes to get in on the act, even in these aspects of religion that are supposed to be individual or small community concerns.
So this is really, I'm looking at this as, it's one of the disadvantages of not separating church and state in Islamic, in the Islamic system. I mean, since they don't have a separation, there's room for, well, lots of corruption, obviously.
Oh, there's room for abuses,
Yeah.
certainly. It's generally an oversimplification to say that Islam is a theocratic system.
I'm not trying to say that. But
Yeah, there's a common perception that there's no distinction between religion and the state, and the religion is the state. The head of state is like a great archbishop who defines doctrine as well as economic policy. Traditionally, Muslim societies haven't worked like that at all. The religious hierarchy, in as much as it has existed, which means not clerics but experts in the law and in theology, have often existed very separately from the state and even in an antagonistic relationship to it. And the state has always been regarded as a kind of rather vulgar thing, sort of fat sultans and corrupt people that religious people don't have much to do with. So the idea that Islamic civilization is naturally theocratic simply isn't borne out by the patterns of Muslim history. But it's a possible source of corruption, but also many Muslims would say that unless you have religious people supervising these things according to proper religious guidelines, everything's going to be done according to people's own personal interests, and so it's necessary that religion dirties its hands, as it were, with politics, because otherwise the public interest will not be served. Yep.
In the United States, is the zakat collected only in the mosque? I think you said earlier there was a chest where people put their money. That would assume that there's an honor system that, for example, in your example where you said $100,000, $2,500, that would assume that you would give that much money without anyone checking on you or knowing, as you might have a country where there's a form where you fill it out on your tax return.
Oh, there's no system of checking, certainly not. And probably only a small percentage of Muslims here do pay the full whack.
And then there really wouldn't be a list of the congregation, then, would there? Or would there?
I don't know what the situation is here, but in England...
They're very good at getting lists and knowing who's there, and you get your little box of envelopes. And
in England, you'll find some mosques which accommodate very closely knit communities. For instance, if a whole village from Kashmir has moved to an area in Oxford, everybody knows each other. They will have a list of everybody. But I think Hakim... Perhaps Hakim could interject something.
Yeah, that's true. A place like that.
In America, you'll find sort of variations on that. In some cases, people are on an honor system in which they give their zakat independently. And traditionally, there are 8 categories in which zakat is meant to be given, with priorities, categories beginning in your immediate neighborhood and so forth. And there are 8 traditional categories in which you pay your zakat. In some communities in America, you'll have more organized communities in which they actually collect the zakat, and they go up to the members of the community who are known and actually collect, and they will help them determine what their income is. And then that group that's appointed amongst them will pay out amongst the community to those 8 categories. So it's a little bit of variation. Generally, it's done independently. A few exceptions.
Okay, do you want to?
Is it paid in one lump sum, or is it, can it be dispersed throughout the year? And also, if it is paid in one lump sum, is there a specific time of the year in which it is paid?
The traditional arrangement is that it's paid, usually people pay at the end of Ramadan. Sometimes people will do it according to the end of the Muslim year, at the beginning of the month of Muharram. But it is permissible just to pick one time of the year. Maybe Abdul Hakim Jackson has better insight since he's an expert in Islamic law, but as I understand it, there's no specific month or date when the zakat has to be calculated and coughed
No,
out.
actually, it's a very individualistic kind of obligation. It's between the individual and God. It's not a right to the state. It's actually a right to the poor. It's an obligation that God places on the more fortunate members of the community to share His bounty with the less fortunate members of the community. And so actually what happens is that it's not an income tax. It's a tax on assets, like he said. So for example, there's a threshold point. You have to have so much in savings that you sustain over a year. And at the end of that year, you pay 2.5% of those savings. So say, for example, I don't know what professor salaries are in England, but they're not $100,000 a year. But let's say I have a savings of $1,000, or say $5,000. Let's say I come to some money today. Well, I have to sustain, and that money is over, I think the threshold level is about $150, between $150 and $175. So let's say I come into $5,000 today. If I sustain that over a year, on this date next year, I'll have to pay 2.5% of that. Okay? But if, for example, before that year expires, my kid falls down, chips a tooth, has to go to the dentist, then I have to spend that money for some legitimate need for my family, because my family comes first, then if that money drops below the threshold, then I'm not obliged to pay at the end of the year. And I have to wait till my savings goes back up above the threshold, it's sustained for the year, and then I pay. So it's not designed to, to be a burden on the community. It's designed really for those people whom God has blessed to have enough sort of disposable income over a sustained period of time, and they take from that to help out the poor and needy.
Is this an individual or is it family? Per family or per individual?
No, per individual. My wife's, in Islamic law, my wife's wealth is her wealth, and I don't have control over that. So she may end up paying zakat where I don't have to pay zakat, or I may end up having to pay zakat where she doesn't have to pay zakat, depending on what the situation might be.
Can we move on now, perhaps? I want to get the other two pillars out of the way before. It's a useful intervention. Thank you for that. Before we break for coffee, I'll try and whiz through the last two pillars.